Nostrand had found himself within the confines of the Dark Sentencer. After deciding to forgo his meeting with his supervisor, this allowed him the freedom to explore the new world that lay ahead of him. After walking into a bar to try and familiarize himself with his new surroundings, he had found a man who would welcome the new inmates. Entering the last meal gave Nostrand a realization. He'd have to provide for himself. When offered a drink, it may carry a heavy price in the future. A price he would not be willing to pay. Otto, on the other hand, was strapped to a medical table. The procedure, standard for new inmates, was fitting him with a gutter. A device that, if activated, would rip and tear the owner's insides asunder. For many men would have this procedure, but Otto was unlike any other. Instead of screaming in agony at the brutal procedure, he merely rolled his eyes as the device locked itself into his body before quickly whisking him away to a cell not built for a man of his size. A little while later, Nostrand had found a friend, a face on this planet of the wretched, despised and disposed of. Nostrand and Pilo went back many years, and began recounting time since past. As the night began to fade away, Nostrand had confessed what had happened to Naya. Uncertain whether his love was alive or dead, Pilo offered a shred of hope. She had mentioned a man named Mr. Wish, and Mr. Wish can only be found through a window. It was in the eyes. The way he spun left 3 times, right 2, then placed his hands flat on the rocks below, never once closing his lids. The movements were erratic and strange to those passing by, beyond their capacity in the way one might listen to a bird sing, but never understanding its intent. He lifted his hands from the earth once more, bringing them up to his ears, starting the ritual from the beginning. After nearly 2 days of walking and watching, dodging the eyes of the supervising officers who might question his lack of branding, Nostrand was sure he'd finally found one. A window. Left, right, wait. The man stopped, and at the end of the dance, closed his eyes. Nostrand looked on past the base of the low suspension bridge where he stood, nervous to be caught staring, but more afraid to lose track of him in the wave of faces and vehicles. The water below the bridge was filthy and clouded, flown in from artificial sources to simplify the scrubbing of the mined core. It was also for drinking, but the HOSS cared much less about that. A slight glow refracted from the surface. Nostrand peered down into the reflection for a moment, the chaotic metropolis of the pavilion miles above where he stood, buzzing with ships of all sizes coming in and out. He almost forgot why he was there. Then, like a train on a track, the man started to run, fast. Nostrand darted behind him, pushing people out of the way to keep in line of sight. He chased him over the bridge, panting. The man's eyes were still closed, but he expertly dodged traffic and objects as if by divine intervention. He seemed to know intuitively that he was being followed. As he came to the decline of the bridge, he didn't hesitate for an instant before folding himself forward and dropping into the putrid water. Nostrand had no choice but to jump too. A dark part of him hoped that this wasn't a window after all, and he'd made a mistake. The moment his body had hit the water, he'd never rise to the surface again. He jammed the melancholy thoughts into a locker of self-pity he stored in his chest and started swimming, his eyes opening in the muddy water. The man was a few feet in front of him and had clearly waited there for a few moments for Nostrand to catch up, even though he still gave no acknowledgement of him. Nostrand paddled desperately. He had never learned how to swim, but he was sure as shit not about to let that stop him now. Below them, the decaying remains of dead bodies littered the floor of the man-made river. There were more than Nostrand was comfortable swimming alongside. The man swam like a frog, approaching the edge of the river where he slithered into a small gap in a pile of rocks. Nostrand shimmied in behind him, his broad shoulders nearly too wide to pass. A soft radiance filtered above the water. It was time to swim up. Nostrand struggled to keep his eyes open in the water for the last few seconds. It stung badly. He followed the man's legs and feet to the surface, gasping for air in resounding heaves. All around them was crude earth, hollowed sepia rock and deep caverns where oceans and rivulets had once borne their way into the sediment from the surface of the planet. The interior levels of the Dark Sentencer were not inhabited. No city structure existed here at the edge of the world. It felt like a dying planet's final recounting of the good old days. Small cracks in the surface exposed a sprinkling of stars just out of reach, a force field keeping them apart. It was serene, exquisite. Nostrand was overwhelmed with emotion, but could never define which one. The man walked, his person now glowing from the contaminated water. Nostrand pulled himself up out of the cavern. He followed in the liquid footsteps, cautious, yet trusting. The air was voltaic. Energy radiated from every crevice. In the distance, tucked behind a cluster of natural columns, he could make out a group of beings. They had formed a circle, some kneeling, others crouched or cross-legged on the warm ground. There were no consistent features to any of them. The group as eclectic and diverse as the rest of the Dark Sentence's population. But these were no ordinary inhabitants. Waves poured from their bodies. Each was locked in a repetitive pattern, a fluid clasping of the hands, shaking of the feet, and rocking. Nostrand thought it looked like music in motion. At the centre of the circle, a being kneeled low, resting their chest on bent thighs. The being was impossible to identify in every way, not by gender, race, or whether it was human or alien. They wore an elaborate mask across their face that purred every few moments, as it pushed some kind of gas into their lungs. Their hands were hidden in foil gloves. None of the windows paid him any mind, even as the man took his place beside them, still soaking wet, and immediately began to rotate his head in a clockwise motion at the neck, around and around, as if stretching the muscles. Nostrand watched for a few moments longer, waiting for a sign. He hadn't come here to be a voyeur. He felt a twinge of guilt for witnessing such a private ceremony without invitation, but it didn't outweigh his need for answers. "Excuse me," he started. "I'm sorry to intrude here, but I'm looking for a Mr. Wish?" More stretching, shaking, clasping, rocking. There was no acknowledgement. Nostrand coughed loudly. "Hello. As I said, I apologize profusely for the interruption. I know you're all, doing what you do. I just need to talk to him. Does anyone know where I might be able to find someone by that name?" Stretch, shake, clasp, rock. Nostrand grew confused and frustrated. He walked closer, moving into the circle and trying to gain the attention of at least one of the windows. Without warning, one of them grabbed his ankle, saying nothing. The being at the center seemed startled, sitting up from their pose and looking at Nostrand for the first time. "Who do you seek?" they asked. Nostrand, who dwarfed the being in size, hunched over to reply. "Are you Mr. Wish?" "I am what they say. I've been searching all over for you. I need to know if you can help me. I'm looking for my girl. Her name's Naya Warren. She may have been murdered on Rutema, and I..." Another window suddenly took Nostrand by the arm and opened up Mr. Wish's ability to see beyond the dimension. Nostrand was rendered momentarily silent by the strength of the energy. He felt it charging through the cold fingertips wrapped around his bicep. "No one by that name wishes to speak to you in the other dimensions." "What do you mean, wishes to speak with me? Does that mean that she's dead and hates me, or is not there?" Nostrand asked. "I cannot say. Listen, I need you to say, okay? I need to know she's dead, because if she's not, I have to get off this planet like yesterday." Nostrand pleaded, angry and desperate. "She is all I have left to live for. Do you understand that? And you cannot say?" Mr. Wish looked at him blankly. "Alright, this was obviously a mistake coming here. Stupid fucking idea. I should have stayed focused on finding a way off this world instead of wasting all of my time trying to talk to a goddamn spirit," Nostrand said. He turned to leave, frustrated. There are many ways out of the dark sentencer, Nostrand Crane. He stops at the sound of his name, knowing he'd never introduced himself. The question stands, why would you believe you have nothing left to live for? Mr. Wish asked, walking towards him, when you have a son who wishes to speak with you. His blood crystallized in his veins, and he stood there paralyzed for a few seconds. This is a joke, he thought. I don't have a son, Nostrand said. Not yet, Mr. Wish said. He swiftly removed one of the gloves, exposing a severely burned hand with brown nails so long they had begun to curl at the end. He reached up to touch Nostrand's cheek. The fleece head of a newborn baby, a heavy rain falling on a man running through ebony streets of an unknowable city, searching for something he cannot find. Small feet padding across hexagons of kitchen tile, perfecting the art of placing one before the other, joyful tears and unfathomable despair. A slideshow of offices filled with medical instruments, charts, expectation, the painted fingernails of a hand reaching out to a cloud, dropping small, dangerous packets into open mouths below, fear and absolution, a glowing, calm blue radiating around, wrapping the universe like a promise kept. Silence. A boy. My sweet, strong boy. Vaxis. Mr. Wish pulled his hand from Nostrand's face, ending the conversation. Nostrand wasn't ready for it to stop. He wanted to stay there forever with this child he'd never met, but somehow had always been. His son. How can... Who? He stumbled. Who is his mother? Mr. Wish carefully slipped his glove back into his mangled hand. It was the last thing Nostrand saw before the club smashed into his skull, rendering him unconscious. The circle regained composure, restarting its endless invocation as Nostrand was dragged silently out of the sanctum and deep into the unknown. The access road from the dorms to the more bustling parts of the city were generally filled with a pastiche of oddball characters. Otto was one of them, tinting the streets with the stop motion of his lengthy limbs moving in opposing succession, standing heads above the crowd. He made it a point to stare at others, intimidating them without speaking a sound. One face he saw every day on his way home from final shift. It belonged to a man who wore a mahogany hair parted slightly off-center and slicked down the sides of his face like poorly fitted earmuffs. Otto instantly disliked him, but other than the requisite glare upon passing, didn't show the man any special attention. He was mostly focused on learning the least that was expected of him where labor was concerned, so he could make the most of his free time on the Dark Sentencer. Otto had a talent for figuring out how to cut corners effectively, but sometimes his temper trumped all reason. As Otto walked back to the dorm from that last shift of the day, he was reminded of an incident that had occurred over a decade before. It was his first gig for a new employer, an alien mob boss called Ribby the Head Aguni, and Otto had been partnered up for a box job with a baby face named Nostrand Crane. Otto couldn't stand anyone, especially on the job, and the chip on his shoulder was so big that day it could have served as an hors d'oeuvre. On the day of the gig, temperatures were record-breaking and aggravation was high to start. Otto remembered his frustration growing as he watched Nostrand computerize the save log, trying thousands of potential combinations. The rage peaked and Otto opted to try and blast it open, a decision that had set them back enough time for this to become dangerous. The job had almost gone completely belly up because of it. Fortunately, Nostrand's green demeanour came with an extra dose of patience, and he cracked the box in the nick of time. When Ribby caught wind of what happened, he tore into Otto, sitting across from the two of them in his sanctuary. His globular orb face jiggled with fury, and the red and blue checked robe that he wore seemed to cut into the jelly of his body. "You think being a giant means that you've got smarts in that big fucking head?"
he screamed at Otto. "You're a special kind of idiot, aren't you? You better get down on your knees and pay this man some respect for saving your moronic ass."
Ribby had continued to berate Otto for losing time on his watch, but Otto started losing himself in the detail again, tuning him out. He was focused on the tiny coloured squares dotting the robe, how their borders lined up just so, swallowing up the next as if they were fighting for space on the fabric. Little red and blue territories. A game of space. His temperature had risen quickly, and he lifted his murderous stare up to meet Ribby's. Otto was sure he was about to do something that would get him killed, but he snapped back to reality when he heard the words of Nostrand. "I disagree, Mr. Aguni. I think that we make a hell of a team, and I want to partner up with him." He looked at the kid and hadn't known what to think, but he did know that no one ever had his back before. It was the first time Otto thought about what the word friend meant, and it hadn't even been said. Now, as his feet hit the rocky ground of an alley he hadn't been down before, years from that first meeting and too far from home to even try and quantify, Otto believed friendship was just a fabrication. Just another way for the world to fuck you. The shadow ahead of him, of the man with parted hair, emerged as he moved between the glowing lights of a Zabian den, junkies stumbling slowly out into the streets and disappearing inside. Otto felt more comfortable in this place every day. He secretly enjoyed learning the schedule of things, the structure of it. The man turned back to look, sensing someone was tailing him. Unfortunately for him, his intuition was slower than the readiness of the tremendous beast who was less than a foot away. Otto grabbed the man by the back of the head, crushing his skull methodically and without emotion. The man fell to the ground and into light final time, his unbuttoned blue-checked shirt splaying open as he hit the floor. None of the passing characters batted an eye. The shrieks and the wails and sharpness of life in this horrible place didn't even pause for a second. Otto took one last glance of the man lying there. Checks. He hated that pattern.
"Less than an hour away from possibly getting eaten like a casserole, and this princess is still sleeping it off."
The voice made its way into lucid dream Nostrand was having. He felt the loud-mouthed humanoid a bit too close to his personal space.
"Wakey, wakey!"
Nostrand did wake, his closed fist simultaneously making contact with a flat, papery face that had taunted him a few inches from his own. Flakes of bright red skin sloughed off and floated through the air between them. "I wouldn't count on that last hour if you get in my face like that again, Red," he said. The humanoid scoffed obnoxiously, but backed off, the cerulean shade of a fresh bruise beginning to make its way across his jaw. Nostrand hated bullies. He believed not abiding by laws didn't have to be synonymous with acting like an arsehole. The cell was filled, but not packed to capacity. There was no seating, no beds, no sink, or even a place to relieve oneself. The only feature was a drain in the middle of the glossy white floor, likely used to easily hose down indiscretions until the next batch of captives arrived. Everything was remarkably clean. Everything except the group of individuals held behind the bars. Nostrand tried to figure out what they were made of. Glass? Crystal? Some type of material no one outside of the Dark Sentence had even heard of yet. He wondered if he could break one, then realized what a stupid thought that was. This cell was a prison within a prison, and whoever built it certainly had thought about people trying to escape. I should have just checked in, a teenager in the corner whispered, seemingly to no one but himself. Why am I like this? He was very small and chewed his cuticles until blood pooled out at the rims, forming in miniature half-moons across his fingertips. Hang in there, mate. It can't be half as bad as they say, can it? Said a chipper alien, with a bald head and a third arm protruding from his chest. I'd rather be working twice as hard down here than up there with a killer waistband. Ain't no way to live, I say. The red humanoid looked incredulous.
"Well, aren't you a ray of sunshine? What kind of fucktwat is excited about being pulled into the funnel by some kind of freak and then judged by a spider woman with the best outcome for you, slave labour, till you keel over and die?"
Well, don't mind your business, or I'll have the sleeping giant knock you out again, the alien said. Like it or not, the Queen of the Dark has come for you anyway. Nostrand sat on the floor next to the nervous teen, ignoring the ravings of the humanoid. "What's your name?" Nostrand asked. The teen eyed him up with caution. "Sam," he said, after a minute. "Nice to meet you, Sam. They call me Nos. Why are you here?" "Do you mean like on the sentencer?" "Yeah, you look like a nice enough kid. What did you do to land yourself on the worst place in the galaxy?" "I was breaking in." "To a house?" "To a dark HOSS network. I hacked into their systems and diverted some funds into my own account," he said, sheepishly. "It started as a little bit here and there. They probably wouldn't have even noticed, honestly. Then it became more. Like millions more." Nostrand couldn't help but laugh. Maybe he was delirious, but he could have been on the brink of a mental breakdown. But this kid was bold, a little stupid, and he loved it. There was a sliver himself in the teen's naivete. A bit of recklessness that had caused one to consult the brain after letting every other body part make a choice. The red humanoid took a piss out of the transparent bars and made a show of it. Nostrand shook his head in irritation, scoffing at the sheer awfulness. "So, why are you here?" Sam finally asked him, watching everyone else in the room. A lot of everything if you're keeping score. My old partner and I had been on HOSS's radar for a long time after a botched job. We were doing a decent job of staying out of sight. The clincher was lifting some government files. That's what got me caught," he said. "I've stolen more money than I can count, killed, maimed, and the thing that took me down was trying to read the paperwork that listed all my indiscretions." Sam was surprised. "What?" he said, suddenly talking a mile a minute. "Why didn't you just plug into a differential server framework and scan all the files under an untraceable alias and then..." "Look, if I knew how to do any of that, do you think that we'd be having this conversation?" Nostrand gave him a look. "Besides, I'm sure you're, 17, 18? You don't have a ton of experience under your belt, but contrary to the advice of greeting cards and self-help books, love doesn't have a lot of patience when you're trying to find out if your lady was murdered in cold blood." "What does your mum count?" "Excuse me?" "I mean, does watching your mum die at 5 years old under, meet your approved guidelines of love and loss?" The two inmates started fighting each other in the corner. The bald alien sang show tunes on the opposite side. Nostrand struggled to find something to say, the circus of background noise drowning out his thoughts. "It's okay. No one really knows how to respond," Sam said. "Listen, I know I probably seem like a child to you, but patronizing is kind of a pet peeve of mine." Nostrand held out his hand. "Let's start this over. Does this work?" Sam shook his hand back. "That's cool. I'm Sam. Happy to meet you." The bars on the cells unlocked, instantly retracting into their predetermined packets. Suddenly, a sea of white flooded in through the opening. At least a dozen guards wearing inflated jumpsuits, bloated with a coolant to keep them safe from the intense heat of the underground. Sleek grey helmets stretched over their heads and down the small of their backs, giving the guards the appearance of elongated skulls. They corralled the cluster of inmates in the cell, poking them with the tips of mismatched thermonic blasters to get them in line. The red humanoid was pushed to the front, running his mouth and fighting every step of the way. Nostrand considered that the guards might knock him off before they even got to where they're going. He wouldn't have blamed them. He found his way to the end and trudged behind the others out of the cell. The hallway was carved out from rock and sediment, like the wiggled-out tunnel of an ant farm. They walked and the ground below them began to slope, and the air around them growing hotter rather than colder, as the guards pushed them deeper into the underground of the dark sentencer. A hum oscillated through the corridor. It multiplied with their footsteps, maturing to a buzz, then a sound like white noise. There seemed to be an opening at the end of the tunnel. Cheers and screams flooded the hallway now. The noise turned to chants, terrifyingly loud. Unified enough that it would make a grown man vomit in fear, which is exactly what the red humanoid did as he tried to turn around, pushing back against the guards, and without hesitation one used the butt of her blaster to jam him in the small of his back. The red humanoid fell on his knees through the opening. "Get up and move in," the guard said. The red humanoid crawled forward to the tip of the group of inmates, which they could now see was a platform. The rest of the view was enough to take your breath away. The platform was carved from the rock and rose nearly 20 feet above an enormous cavern, reaching up at the sides like an oversized ribcage to protect the soft flesh of a lung. A bony structure lined the walls, made from the same material as the bars in the cell, crystalline and indestructible, equal parts horrible and magnificent. Nostrand peered over the side of the platform ledge, looking down at the thousands upon thousands of prisoners below. Many of their appendages had been replaced with crude braces and supports, scraps of metal and other materials drilled deep into the bones to keep the limbs moving far beyond their shelf life. Their eyes had an orange glow to them, golden light shining off the way fog emanates from heated water on a cold day. The flesh had been burned off the most of their faces at random, pieces dripping and hanging in some places. Nostrand couldn't be sure whether they were worn-out machines with human features or the other way around. His eardrums bulged painfully in rhythm with the endless chanting. Silence. The prisoners all turned their attention forward immediately at the sound of the woman's voice. Sam looked back at Nostrand, his eyes wide with fear. Nostrand peered over the shoulders of the other inmates, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening ahead, but with the guards blocking them, he couldn't get a clear view beyond the bodies that stood before him. The red humanoid was first up. He stood at the front of the platform, cowering. Across the cavern, in a throne fashioned from a myriad of luminous fibers, sat the one known as the Glass Widow. The throne was raised on its own pulpit, separating her from the prisoners. She was dressed entirely in white, her armor of frosted and unmatched feat in biomechanics, coated in shatterproof and environmentally receptive glass. Positioned perilously on her pearl-white hair sat a crown that swirled across portions of her face, wired to a system of crystalline tubes interconnecting technology that spidered out into the waxen filaments, reaching to every part of the cavern like a web. She was death by electrocution, beyond stunning. Welcome to Level 0. Here you will find that you answer only to me. She paused for dramatic effect. And to yourselves. I don't care why you've been sentenced to this planet. Your past means nothing to me, and nor should it to you. If you're deemed fit to work in these sacred mines, you'll become a subserver, married to this ancient place, until you die and return the energy that created you. Those unable to perform will serve in a different way, by feeding those that work to be free of the dying planet of this chains. The sea of subservers raised their hands up, knowing what was to come. Let this judgment be brief and fair, she said. Then she rose from her throne and eyed the red humanoid. You look able-bodied. Likely you would have provided us many years of labor, she continued. But my guards tell me you've been a challenge for them, and for your fellow cellmates. There is no time for difficulty in this level. Her eyes narrowed. Food, she said. The red humanoid attempted to throw himself over the edge of the platform. Without warning, the luminous strands from her crown elongated, forming a noose that caught his neck as he fell, hanging above the crowd of the waiting subservers. When his body was still, the web dropped him on the other side of the cavern into a waiting bin surrounded by guards. She repeated this process, one prisoner after another, judging them solely on estimated productivity in the grueling, blazing conditions of the 0 level. Serve. Food. Serve. Serve. Food. Nostrand heard the voice sentence Sam to serve. He wasn't sure if he'd be relieved or sad that the kid would have to do labor here. Sam definitely wasn't built for physical labor. Nostrand made a mental note to look for him when he made it through sentencing. He felt a bizarre sense of responsibility to him, even after just one conversation. Nostrand waited on the platform for his turn. For judgment, his mind wandered to a moment when he was a boy on Rutema. The past is all you have. He's outside, standing in the light of a warm afternoon, as his dad talks about an antique vase he's picked up,
marvelling at the history it carries. His parents have taken him to a street fair in the heart of the city. The colours of the tents cascade around him in a parade of primaries and pastels. Smells of hot slabs of meat and vegetable and grills. The sweetness of iced pastries, peppery green of freshly cut flowers. Nostrand feels happiness here, with his mother at his side, and his father pointing out knickknacks and vintage maps of the galaxy. Nostrand slips away from his parents, turning a few tents ahead to a vendor of pets. Lined up in a row are a number of small habitats containing an assortment of aquatic creatures. Some swimming in loops, others are taking in the sun on miniature stones placed in their jars. As he looks at the animals, he feels an overwhelming to touch one. As he does, Nostrand can't help but to look around and make sure that no one's watching, before scooping the tiny creature into his short little hand. He carries it tightly a few blocks before his mother notices. As any good mother would be, she's disappointed in her son and angry that he's capable of taking something that doesn't belong to him. Please, can't you just be mad, but let me keep it anyway? Nostrand begs. It's not my judgment to make, Nos, his mother says. There will be times in your life that you'll make choices I can't protect you from. She marches him back to the vendor to return the scared, slimy amphibian. Nostrand could still hear her slender fingers on the back of his neck, pushing him forwards. The shopkeeper is grateful, quietly smiling at Nostrand's mother in solidarity. He leans down and thanks the boy for bringing him back. Then, unexpectedly, the shopkeeper says, "Dear child, what you've done is wrong by the standards of the universe, but I believe every creature deserves to be loved by someone who would steal for it. He belongs to you now." He hands the tiny little animal back to Nostrand, giving his father a small jar to contain it. The family walks away from the vendor, not knowing if this was the greatest lesson their son would ever receive, or something else. As Nostrand heard the guards yelling for him to step forward, so many years later, the verdict was still out. He raised his eyes and looked at the woman who would seal his fate. His self-assuredness had evolved and her hair was different, but she could still command the hell out of a room. There was no mistaking the flicker of recognition in the deep eye beneath the crown. It was Naya. Nostrand watched the moment unfold around him like a silent film. She paused, tilting her head ever so slightly to the right, boring a hole into his soul with her eye. Without giving away her position, Naya held open hand in his direction and addressed Nostrand for the first time since the failed heist. "You look like a man willing to break his back to serve his queen," she said without emotion. "Disappoint me, and you'll be hanged." "Serve." The web extends from her crown once more, cupping Nostrand in a cocoon as it envelops him, then drops him into the ocean of subservers who wait with open arms at the latest acquisition.